discuss these new voting restrictions is Devon Crawford. He's a staff director at the Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to BNC. Devon, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you a great deal for having me, Tashani.
And now these new bills would largely impact voters of color. That's what we're hearing, despite no evidence of voter fraud in the 2020 election. Are we in a new Jim Crow era, in your opinion?
Thank you so much for the question. To be sure, what we're witnessing in this country is truly a Machiavellian frenzy to not only restrict voting, but in a real sense, to restrict democracy. We have seen no less than 361 bills introduced across 47 different states, as you noted, to restrict voting access, to limit early voting, to limit drop-off boxes. And in a real sense, this is not only Jim Crow, but it's Jim Crow 2.0. Because when you think about it, it's not only African Americans who are impacted disproportionately by this restricting of democracy, but we also have to think about our elders. We have to think about young people who may not have proper voter ID laws or voter ID for the particular laws. We must be very clear that this is a matter of restricting the franchise, of restricting our democracy, and we must ever be vigilant to strategize and create tools so that all of our people can have access to the voting franchise.
And Devon, there's so much in this bill. I mean, can you just kind of break it down and explain how it will impact, if so, minority voters now and in the future?
Absolutely. For instance, we've seen in Georgia, where we've seen historic elections of two Democratic senators, Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, as well as flipping the state blue to support President Joe Biden, the introduction of Senate Bill 202. Which not only restricts early voting in the state of Georgia, but check this out, it also makes it a crime to give water to voters who are standing in line or snacks to voters who are standing in line. So you have to think about how this affects differently abled persons who are voting, elderly persons who are voting. We have to think about voter caging and how this allows anyone to file an unlimited amount of challenges to voters in their county, thus backing up the process of counting votes. We have to think about the ways that it targets drop-off boxes, which are helpful for people who are trying to vote early, voting absentee, particularly in this last election cycle where we saw the mail was slowed down. So this is a very intentional backlash to what we've seen in 2020 and in the runoffs of January 2021. And we must be vigilant. This is something that we must continue to push back on. We must continue to fight for the very crown jewel of the civil rights movement, which was the Voting Rights Act and the right for all citizens to participate in this democracy.
So, Devon, you're saying that this bill, or these bills, better yet, that are currently being passed in Florida and in Georgia will directly impact minority voters. So how do we get around this? Because we still have another election coming up. We still have to vote on the local level. So what do we do?
Absolutely. So at the same time where we see 361 bills that are introduced to restrict voting, there have been 800 plus bills that have been introduced to expand voting. So when we think about expanding early voting, which has been used by African American congregations with their souls to the polls efforts, we think about working class people who can't stand in line on election day for an hour or longer. We have to improve access from multidisciplinary measures. So from early voting, from absentee voting to easing voter ID laws, so that we're not meeting or creating disproportionate responses to an issue of voter fraud, which was the big lie we understood from the 2020 election cycle in the last administration. So while we're seeing a flood of legislation meant to restrict voting, I'm also encouraged by the ways that we are seeing the introduction of legislation to expand access by champions in Congress and in our state legislatures across the country.
And can you tell us how your work is helping to do just that?
Absolutely. So at the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, we are housed at the Harvard Kennedy School, but we support organizations, individuals, and governments working at the grassroots level to bolster their social justice agendas. So particularly in the next month, we are bringing together academics, activists, and artists together for a convening on achieving our country, an Academy of Citizen Activism, where we're going to focus on the pressing challenges of democracy, of voter suppression, of voter restriction, bringing in champions such as LaTosha Brown and NSAE UFUT from Georgia to share best practices, to share strategies as to the ways that we can reclaim our democracy and make sure that it's equitable for all of our citizens. This is just the beginning. But we're looking to expand this effort throughout the country so that all citizens are empowered by one person, one vote.
I love that. And what can you tell our audience members who are listening right now? How can they get involved? How can they expand their right to vote and make sure that it's not being restricted by their local lawmakers?
Absolutely. I would invite all those who are listening to join us at our convening. It is open to all citizens, to all who are listening, to join the Trotter Collaborative as we think about these strategies. I would encourage you to call your legislators to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to restore those provisions that ensure that the federal government will protect those citizens who are in our states that are being targeted by these Machiavellian laws. I would encourage you to call your state houses, to call your governors, to ensure that they hear your voice and that they understand that this is one of the critical issues of our democracy at this time. All of our citizens are empowered with our voices and our vote to make a change in this democracy.
Got it. So it's not about just laying down and taking it, but it's about standing up and making sure your vote and your voice is also heard at the same time.
Absolutely. That's the legacy and the tradition that we're upholding with Reverend C.T. Vivian, with John Robert Lewis. This is the legacy of African Americans to fight and protect those rights that make us full citizens in this country. And so we're continuing that at the Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice. We invite all of you to join us at Achieving Our Country to learn more about how you can work in your particular community to join this effort and fight.
Devon Crawford, thank you so much for joining us on BNC, sir, and we look forward to welcoming you back. You did a good job on your first appearance here. Thank you.
It's certainly a pleasure.